Hello, my name is Austin Habich, the founder of Think Catholic, your source for Catholic thought with both depth and devotion, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. Joining me is Clare and Dr. Alan Fimister as we ask, does God exist? And the Catholic thought on the topic comes to us from the 19th century First Vatican Council, which states, quote, "The same Holy Mother Church holds and teaches that God, the beginning and end of all things, can be known with certitude by the natural light of human reason from created things. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made," end quote. Now, before getting into the proof, I think it's worth asking who in this question has the burden of proof. For we know that in disputes, whether in law or philosophy, what is established first of all is who carries that burden. In other words, who in the dispute is burdened primarily with the task of bringing forth evidence and substantiating their claim. In law, for example, we are all familiar with the phrase innocent until proven guilty, which means innocence is presumed for the defense from the outset, and the burden of proof falls on the prosecution to establish otherwise. In philosophy, and it makes a lot of sense, the burden of proof falls upon the one challenging the universal assumption or the status quo. As written by the University of Oxford, quote, "If in some situation there is a proper presumption that something is true, anyone seeking to prove its opposite is said to bear the burden of proof," end quote. That's from their Dictionary of Philosophy. For instance, if someone doesn't believe that the world is real, that it's all a dream, and all our experiences are really just machines transmitting sensations directly into our disembodied brains in some factory somewhere, well, we don't carry the burden of having to disprove him or even entertain him, because the plain and obvious, as evidenced by essentially unanimous opinion, holds his position as something already disproved, as something clearly false. This man's position starts in the red, so to speak, and he must find a way to crawl himself out by bringing forth very convincing evidence, if he can, for his theory, before one need even entertain it. He bears the burden of proof, and so does the person who holds that God or thinks that God doesn't exist, because in both cases humanity has already ruled on the question, and it is ruled against them. As I wrote in the article titled Worship on Think Catholic, across the world and found on the most obscure and abandoned islands, there are altars. In places dissimilar both by creed and code, these altars, whether in Japan, Hawaii, or across Europe and Asia, testify to a common yearning, a yearning for worship. But worship presupposes the existence of some divine thing, some sustainer, some creator. And even before Christ, so around the 300s BC, Aristotle said on his work on the heavens, all men believe in gods. Augustine in 400 AD on his commentary on Psalm 53, which says that the fool says in his heart there is no God, he says very few there are, and a difficult thing it is to meet with a man that says in his heart there is no God. Not much then is that which we are bid to endure, hardly is it to be found. Uncommon is that sort of man. In the 700s, John Damascene will say, "For the knowledge of God's existence has been implanted by him and all by nature." And in 2011, here in America, Gallup Analytics and Advisory did a poll that found that 92% of Americans believe in God. Now, that's just about everyone. So the burden of proof, as contrary to the essentially unanimous and universal opinion, falls not on us, the theist, but on the one who holds God's existence in doubt or is against it. So there's a sense in which we shouldn't even feel like we have to prove God's existence. Like we shouldn't feel like we have to prove that the world is real. Both stand already proven. Yeah, why not look at the proof? But first, Clare, Doc, any thoughts before we begin?
So when we begin to have the conversation about arguments for the existence of God, it's very important that we clarify what we mean by God. To avoid falling into the logical fallacy of equivocation, we want to make sure that when we talk about God, we are talking about the God from Exodus 3:14, the God whose very nature, as he identifies himself to Moses in the burning bush, I am who am. His very nature is being. And that means, because his nature is being, he's not one being among many. He's not the highest degree of something. He's not like Zeus or a Superman. We're not going to find him in a physical place. He's going to be something totally other than our experience of beings in the world. We encounter people, we encounter trees and dogs and plants and mountains. But God is going to have to be something completely different than that. Something that transcends all of it, something that maintains all of it in being. Recognizing first, that is the sort of God that we're going to be arguing for. It's going to require a different line of argumentation, a different line of proof than if we wanted to prove the existence of a particular person. We wanted to prove that this person is guilty of murder. We're going to find evidence and testimony. We're going to find other material, tangible things to point to this person's guilt or innocence. But when we're talking about proving the existence of God, we're going to have to take a line of reasoning that is somewhat unfamiliar to a lot of people, because it requires thinking about things in a very different way than we're used to, because we're talking about being itself rather than a being among many.
Another thing I think is important to remember is the basis of that teaching of Vatican I is in Scripture, in the Book of Wisdom and in St. Paul's letter to the Romans, where he says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of men, who by their wickedness distort the truth, because what can be known about God is clear to them, because God has made it clear to them ever since the creation of the world. His invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, have been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. Therefore they are without excuse, for though they knew God, they did not honour him as God or give thanks to him, but became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Now, something very important about that passage is it's clear from that all men who fail to worship the one true God of Exodus 3:14 that Clare mentioned are culpable. And this leads to another important conclusion, which is that it is certainly possible to demonstrate the existence of God by philosophical reasoning, but the existence of God is also manifest to all men by common sense, which is the reasoning which is essentially of a philosophical nature, but which human beings undertake subconsciously, which is why Aristotle thinks that the common sense assumptions of human beings shouldn't be disproven. If your philosophical reasoning diverges greatly from common sense, that's a sign there's something wrong with your philosophical reasoning. And Pius X makes that distinction in his oath against modernism, where he says, first of all, I profess that the one true God, our Creator and Lord, may be certainly known by the natural light of human reason from the things that have been made, and therefore his existence may also be demonstrated. That is, that all human beings know the existence of God by the natural light of human reason, and this can also take a formal philosophical form, but it doesn't have to. It's apparent in a way that renders all men inexcusable, even without formal training in philosophy.
So what I hear you two saying, Clare is saying, since we're talking about being itself instead of a particular being, the evidence for and the argumentation to is going to be a little bit more lofty and abstract. And Doc, what I'm hearing you say is there is a very real sense in which God's existence is completely plain and obvious, and then maybe through moral dilemmas or maybe wishful thinking in the wrong sense, difficult to see. And the analogy that comes to mind is there's a sense in which we're trying to prove someone has a nose. It's so clear, it's so close to your face that and in one sense it's plain and obvious. In another sense, it's almost too close to be visible. It's almost invisible in that sense. Well, let's go ahead and get into the proof. Two things that are absolutely indisputable, and the first is that things exist, and the second is that things change, and neither would be possible without God. Taking the first, things exist, that's pretty clear, and how that proves God is probably easiest understood by analogy. Take the lights in the room, for example. A light bulb lights up the room because it has electricity, which it has from the socket in the ceiling. And the socket in its turn has electricity from the wires that are connected to it. The wires then in their turn have electricity from the local circuit breaker, and the circuit breaker has electricity from something else, from something else, from something else. However, at the beginning of this series of things which have electricity, there is something that we wouldn't say has electricity, but rather is generating electricity, and generating it for anything else which happens to have electricity. And at any moment, it happens to have electricity. And the moment that generator cuts off, Claire, what happens to the lights in the room?
They shut off.
Absolutely. No electricity generator of some sort, no working lights in the room. In the same way, if you look at your hand, it has its existence from the various cells which make it up. And those cells have their existence from the elements which make them up, and those elements in their turn have their existence from the atoms which make them up, and so on and so forth. But for any of these things to have existence, there must be something out there that does not have, but simply is existence, and is generating the existence for anything else which happens to have existence. And at any moment, it happens to have existence. And whatever just is existence exists necessarily, must have always existed, and is responsible for anything else that exists. And this is exactly what God claims to be when he reveals himself to Moses. He says of himself, I am who I am. In other words, I am. I am existence itself. And as an aside for the philosophers out there, it's important to note that this argument follows whether or not those more fundamental parts, the atoms and quarks and so on, are within the whole actually or virtually, which is debated, but the argument follows either way. I would also like to point out an objection, and this comes to this argument, which comes from Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion, writing about Aquinas' first three ways, which the argument I've just given would be similar to. He says, quote, all three of these arguments rely upon the idea of a regress and evoke God to terminate it. They make the entirely unwarranted assumption that God himself is immune to regress. Even if we allow the dubious luxury of arbitrarily conjuring up a terminator to an infinite regress and giving it a name simply because we need one, there is absolutely no reason to endow that terminator with any of the properties normally ascribed to God, omnipotence, goodness, etc. End quote. In layman's terms, the first thing Dawkins is saying is that sure, at any moment the light bulb has its electricity from the socket, from the circuit breaker, which has it from something else, but to think that such a series must terminate in something that's generating electricity, well, that's entirely unwarranted. To refute Dawkins, one need only cease paying the electric bill, and then see if it is, in fact, true that some kind of generator was entirely unwarranted for working lights in the room. Because if all there is are things which have their electricity from another, without some non-receiving electricity generator out there, then nothing would have it, because there would be nothing for them to ultimately have the electricity from. In the same way, if all there is out there are things which have their existence from another, then nothing would exist, for there would be nothing to ultimately have existence from. The second concern of Dawkins: why is it that this terminating thing escapes regress itself? Well, because that's exactly what it means to be a generator. In both the analogy and the reality, It is a thing which need not receive from another. Electricity in the one case and existence in the proof. This is precisely what we mean by the term subsistent in the scientific name for God, subsistent existence. Dawkins' third concern is why should such a thing be God, understood by classical theism, aka having the divine attributes? This is because whatever exists in the effect must pre-exist in some way in its cause. In a common phrase, one cannot give what he first does not have. Thus, this subsistent existence, by being the cause of all being, goodness, power, and intelligibility, whether actual or even possible, must possess these attributes prior to them, as the source of them. But to possess both all actual and possible being, goodness, power, and intelligibility is exactly what it means to be omnipresent, omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient. And on the topic, I would also recommend Dr. Fazer's book, 5 Proofs for God, since he meticulously carries all of his arguments down all the way to the normally attributed divine attributes. That is the proof of God from existence.
Just to add on to what Mr. Dawkins says, that old kind of argument against God that he used in objection to Thomas Aquinas is sort of just a grown-up version of the schoolyard bully argument. Well, then who created God? That's why I think the definition of God is so important going from the onset. God is the uncreated creator. To ask the question, who created the uncreated creator, is just a silly question. I want to pose the argument. This is different than the one that Austin just gave us. This is a means of argument. It's not a proof in the strictest sense. This was formulated in its most popular form by C.S. Lewis. This is called the argument from desire, and it runs like this. Human beings, like all other animals, have certain natural desires. We hunger, we thirst, we desire sexual intimacy, we desire entertainment and rest. For all of these natural desires, we find real means of satisfying them. For hunger, we find food. For the desire for sexual intimacy, we find sex does in fact exist. For rest, we find that sleep exists. For entertainment, we find the creativity of human beings to, satisfy this quite easily. We find all manner of ways of entertaining ourselves. But there is a desire that human beings seem to have, which goes beyond all of these other desires. For all the other natural desires, a certain amount of the good satisfies it. For your hunger, there's a certain amount of food that satisfies your hunger. And to eat beyond that, the desire you have, the pleasure you enjoy when you eat the food would actually turn to pain. You can only eat so much food before you become stuffed and it becomes painful. But this other desire that we find we have does not seem to be the sort of thing we can satisfy. And I'm talking specifically about the desire for happiness. For happiness, we would sacrifice food and sleep and sex and entertainment if we could attain real happiness. Now, we have a bit of a problem because we find that the kind of happiness that human beings want, that our desire for happiness seems to grow as we attain happiness. For every goal that we set our minds to, for every means of attaining happiness that we pursue, on the acquisition of that happiness, we find that our capacity for happiness has grown. That isn't to say that we have to be dissatisfied or discontent with our lives, but we find that with every new happiness we have, we are capable of being happier. And our desire is always to be happier than we presently are. So if we follow this line of reasoning, we find ultimately that it seems the desire for happiness in the human person is infinite, that it doesn't seem like anything we find in the world can fully satisfy it, can actually quench our thirst or satiate our hunger, so to speak. This leads us ultimately to some perfect good, the acquisition of which would give us the perfect happiness that we seek out, and this would be God. Some objections that might be posed about this would be the question, well, why do we have to say that every natural desire does in fact correspond to a natural means of satisfying it? Now, the full kind of response to that is probably an answer that is beyond the scope of this episode. But we find that it is, in fact, the case of all biological organisms, and that to say that human beings who are willing to sacrifice all of these other natural desires for this other one, the object of which does not exist, we would have to admit that out of all nature, human beings are the sole species whose very nature is insanity. For the beavers and the dogs and the giraffes, they have the means, the real means of achieving all of their desires. But human beings, for whatever reason, they are frustrated forever in this natural desire that they find within themselves. They will never be able to satisfy it. Another objection might be the person who says, well, I am perfectly satisfied. Or if I am not, it is because I have a desire for something other than God, and the acquisition of that would satisfy me. To the second person, it's a pretty easy response. You can say, well, go ahead and try. It seems that course of action always ends in frustration. But to the first person, the person who insists that they are already perfectly satisfied, I'm reminded of a passage from St. John of the Cross where he speaks of the infinite caverns in the human person. The infinite caverns, the first two of which are the infinite cavern of the intellect and of the will, where the intellect desires to know truth and constantly seeks after the truth, the perfect truth, the whole truth, the final truth. And the infinite cavern of the will desires the perfect good. Now, John of the Cross points out very eloquently that there's two means of responding to these infinite caverns if one rejects God, if one rejects that there is, in fact, an infinite good to fill this empty space. There is the surface level living, which I think is the person who says they're already perfectly satisfied. The living shallowly, accepting kind of a shoddy impression of happiness, accepting only a shadowy reflection of the good that the human heart desires, accepting something less than the best, choosing to be happy, but not to pursue happier. Or there is the temptation to fill that infinite cavern with finite goods, to attempt the mathematical impossibility of finishing counting to infinity, filling an infinite space with finite goods, which is ultimately a test of futility. It's ultimately going to be frustrating and disappointing to the person who attempts it.
I'm reminded of the quote by Blaise Pascal. He says, if man is not made for God, why is he only happy in God? Go ahead, Doc.
One argument that particularly struck me when I was an adolescent is the one which St. Thomas expresses in his fourth way of proving the existence of God in the Summa Theologiae, but which also appears in some other places. For example, in Descartes' Meditations, where it often gets lost as it's surrounded by a number of less impressive arguments. This argument is an argument from perfection or the gradation of perfection in things. We look around us and we see that every single thing we experience is better than it could be and worse than it could be in various different degrees, and that it more or less attains to some standard of absolute perfection, but it never actually attains to absolute perfection. We see this also in ourselves. We find ourselves to be imperfect. So we know that we are not the standard of perfection by which we are judging the imperfection of the things outside of ourselves. And we know that we can't be wrong about this, because if I hold myself to be imperfect, I must be right, because if I were to err about that error would itself be an imperfection. So my knowledge of my own perfection is absolutely certain. But it's not possible to perceive degrees of perfection in things unless one has in advance some knowledge of what perfection is, so that one can see that these things fail to meet that standard. We can, of course, attribute the idea of perfection arbitrarily to something. We can consider that a cup of tea, or Liechtenstein, or Jimmy Stewart are the embodiments of perfection, but in order to arbitrarily attribute perfection to something limited and flawed in that way, we have to already have the concept of perfection in order to attribute it arbitrarily, and therefore we must have derived the concept of perfection from something which simply is perfect, simply and in an unlimited fashion. This is God, who is infinite in all perfections, and all the other attributes of God given to him in classical theism follow logically from the existence of a being infinite in all perfections, that he'd have to be unable to not be, from which every other attribute of God would also follow. Now, there's one possible objection that someone could make to this argument, which is that we don't have immediate knowledge of the divine nature. If we did, we would already be in heaven. So how can it be that we're judging the perfection and imperfection of everything else and of ourselves by a standard to which we're certain we have no access? I think this isn't really an atheistic objection, it's a sort of theological objection. But I mean, the premise of it is sound. The reason why we are able to perceive the degrees of perfection in things, even though we don't have an immediate knowledge of God, is because we know the natures of things. We perceive what it is to be a stone or an apple or a cabbage or a rabbit, and we see that these things are better or worse instances of those natures. But the fact that things have objective universal natures is only intelligible because they are created out of nothing by an infinitely powerful mind. Now, that's just the answer to a subtle theological objection to the argument. In itself, the argument stands. It's not possible that we have certain knowledge of a standard of absolute perfection without it being the case that something absolutely perfect exists, and that is what we call God.
Doc, thank you for that very coherent presentation of the fourth way of Aquinas, which I think a lot of times is overshadowed by those other of Aquinas' 5 ways. One of those 5 ways is one that I promised a little bit earlier to describe. I mentioned that if things exist and that things change would only be possible if God exists. The second from change, Aquinas' first way, we can begin something like this. In the absolute broadest sense, change is the transition from can to is. My hand can move the coffee mug, and now it is. I can reach over to pick up my cell phone, now I am. Hence change. Now, some thought, previous to Aristotle, that change was actually a transition from what is not to what is. But this can't be the case because, as the saying goes, from nothing, nothing comes. Unless we suppose that for every single change there is also occurring a complete out of nothing creation of something new. But even here we would not have change, since change presupposes the same thing becoming different. And in the case of creation, it is not the same thing becoming different, but nothing becoming something. So our definition for change stands: the transition from can to is, or in technical language, and it's important as we go forward to use the technical terms, from what is potential to what is actual. And it is only possible if there exists out there something completely unchanging. For when my hand goes from potentially moving to actually moving, it can only do so because the muscles in my arm, which can potentially contract, are actually contracting, which can only contract because some series of motor neurons that can potentially fire are actually firing, and so forth and so on. But if all there is in this series are things which receive actuality from another, without something out there that just possesses it by virtue of itself, then none would have it and nothing could change, for there would be nothing for these receivers or changers to derive their actuality from. It would be like an endless series of relay runners, all waiting for someone before them before they can begin running. And if that's all that's out there, then without someone to start the relay, none of its members could even begin to run. No one would be moving. So for anything to be able to receive actuality or change, there must be something out there not receiving actuality, not changing, in order to actualize it. So change presupposes some unchanged changer, and more than that, it presupposes the God of classical theism. For as the cause of any and all actuality, this unchanged changer must have absolutely no potential within it. Otherwise, it too would have to receive actuality from something else, which, as we have said, would render change impossible. And whatever lacks potential completely, including the potential to be perfected, whether in power, goodness, or knowledge, while at the same time being the cause of all increases in power, goodness, knowledge, etc., existing or even possible, must itself be all good, all powerful, all knowing. In short, God. So change requires an unchanged changer, which requires the God of classical theism. And before we get into those practicalities of how we share these proofs with others, what are some last comments, some other things that we would mention on the topic?
I think it's important to remember and recognize the limits of reason. Through these logical proofs and arguments, we can know a lot about God. We can be certain of the existence of a God who is omnipotent, who at every moment holds all things in being, who is all perfection. But there are a lot of things about God that we can't know through reason alone, because God is infinite and our minds are finite. It's like when you are interested in a person, you can know a lot about them by doing some reconnaissance work, by doing research on them, so to speak. You can ask their friends about them. You can ask their coworkers, their family. You can look them up on the internet. You can know a lot about the person that way, but you won't know the person until you speak to them and you hear what they have to say for themselves, until the person reveals who they are to you. The only way to be in relationship with another person is to hear what they say of themselves. And so reason is wonderful. Reason can show us the truth of God's existence, but faith is still necessary. Reason is not a replacement for faith. And faith is how we are led into faith through revelation, especially, is how we know who God is, because he condescends to reveal himself to us.
Yes, I would agree with that, certainly. I think on the positive end, in regard to these proofs of the existence of God, particularly St. Thomas's 5 ways, I think it's important to emphasize two things. One is that they are demonstrations. They're not scientific proofs. People nowadays can often fall into the error of imagining that proofs in the natural sciences are the gold standard of rationality, but in fact, this isn't the case. Proofs in the natural sciences constitute hypothetical models which have resisted attempts to test them to destruction, and therefore prevail for the time being until they are inevitably overthrown. They fall, in a sense, infinitely short of, for example, proofs in mathematics, which permanently and irrevocably demonstrate their own conclusions, and proofs in philosophy. And these are properly philosophical demonstrations, which certainly demonstrate the existence of God.
Doc, I'm hearing you mention two things that are absolutely critical to remember. The first is the timelessness of these proofs. As you said, it's not, based on, what contemporary science happens to say at this moment in history. Aristotle's proof for God from change, that's over 2,000 years old. And the second thing I'm reminded hearing you speak there, Doc, is I think a lot of people who feel like there's no good proof for God maybe have just never heard the correct articulation of these proofs. They get a watered down or an estranged version of Aquinas' five ways, or anything from the Catholic tradition. And so as we start to consider, how do we share these proofs with others, I'm reminded by this quote by St. John Henry Newman. He says, "A man can be convinced without being persuaded." So what I think he's mentioning here is that you can have the syllogism, but for whatever reason it isn't communicated properly, or someone isn't open to hearing it. But there is another factor in showing someone that God exists besides the bare facts and the internal logic of the argument. And for my part, I would just say, for those listening, if you're speaking to someone and they say to you, well, I don't think God exists, I think it's a good idea to ask them, well, would they want God to exist? Because that's going to tell you a lot. If they say, because if God is all good, all knowing, all benevolent, and he's caring for us, well, of course, anyone would want such a being to exist if he does exist. So if you say to someone, well, would you want God to exist? And they say no, well, maybe there's something more going on here. It might be more of a heart issue than a head issue, or they may just not know what we mean when we talk about God. We may be talking past one another. And if you ask them, well, would you want God to exist? And they say, yeah, well, he does. And we can show them that. So just to clear the field, I think it's a good idea maybe to begin with a question like that. Claire, what would you say is a practical piece of advice?
I think that's a great way to start the conversation, to identify if it's a head problem or a heart problem. In my interaction with people who are questioning whether they would describe themselves as atheists or agnostics, I find that it's very rarely just an intellectual issue. I find that so much of the time there is, like you said, a heart issue, especially if they've been mistreated at the hands of people who call themselves Christians, especially if they're reeling from the problem of evil, the question, why do good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people? And I mean, that's a different sort of problem to tackle than just the existence of God. But I think you're absolutely correct that before you can begin to share arguments for the existence of God, you do have to determine whether it's a head problem or a heart problem, and if it's a heart problem, what that's due to. If it's a problem of I know plenty of people who hate Christ because of Christians, and so if that's the issue, then that's a place to begin to show the distinction between the Catholic doctrine and the people who practice it, the fallible, sinful people like you and me who practice it. But it gets a little more complicated if it's something like the problem of evil, because then that really should be the place to start rather than jumping into the arguments for the existence of God. I agree with you about how to start that way.
Another two things which are often difficulties when one is trying to share these arguments. One of them is the distinction in technical language between per se and per accidens causation. That means the difference between a historic series of causes and what is causing something now. People often suppose falsely that St. Thomas's first way, which he says is the most manifest of the five ways which Austin described, that there's somehow an objection to it, to say that it would be possible for the universe to have always existed, and that therefore no infinite cause is necessary to explain the sequence of finite causes. This rests on a misunderstanding. It's possible. St. Thomas held it was possible. He wrote a work arguing that it was possible that the universe had always existed. He said that it hadn't always existed, but that we know that because of Scripture, because of divine revelation, not because of natural reason. So my laptop is on the desk in front of me because a colleague of mine put it there, and the colleague put it there because I bumped into him downstairs, and I was downstairs because I was trying to get a cup of coffee, and so on and so on. And this kind of sequence of historic causes could theoretically continue forever. God could have made a universe that had an infinite past history because God is outside of time. But the reason the laptop is actually there, the real reason now that the laptop is there, is the table. And the reason the table is there is the floor, and the reason the floor is there is the walls, and the reason the walls are there is the foundation, and the foundations are there because of the hill that the building is on. So, and that kind of per se causation, that kind of sequence can't go on forever. Just as if you saw a hook dangling in midair, sorry, not a hook, a chain dangling in midair, and somebody said to you, what's that doing there? They wouldn't be satisfied with the answer, it has an infinite number of links. They would want to know that there was a hook somewhere secured to something which the chain was hanging from. Or if you saw a train moving along the tracks as far as the eye could see, and you ask, how is that moving? They wouldn't be satisfied with the answer, it has an infinite number of carriages. Per se causes have to have a finite beginning, and that finite beginning has to be sufficiently powerful to explain their very existence. And as the difference between existence and non-existence is infinite, it has to be an infinitely powerful cause at the end of a finite series of per se causes. The other difficulty which one encounters in sharing these proofs is the kind of idolatrous deism which is adopted by many people who don't believe in God. That is, obviously in a way, deists themselves don't believe in God. They're kind of pagans who believe in a very lonely Jupiter. But atheists are also usually deists in the sense that the God that they're denying the existence of is some kind of bearded gentleman who works out a lot, of the nature that of the one painted on the Sistine Chapel ceiling by Michelangelo, which I think may have been a historic mistake in interior decor for the church, because in general the church has been quite reserved and nervous about depictions of God the Father as an old man, or indeed depictions of God the Father at all, because God the Father never became incarnate. And of course we do depict God the Holy Spirit symbolically as a dove, but the dove is relatively obviously symbolic, whereas it's quite easy to mistakenly suppose that we're actually asserting that God the Father is an anthropomorphic being looking like an old man. And that's very pleasing for atheists, because it's very much easier to deny the existence of Jupiter than it is to deny the existence of subsistent being itself. So it's very important that we should make it clear that these are purely symbolic depictions of God, and that God, as he is in himself, is because infinitely intelligible, invisible to any created mind, and not capable of being depicted in any way.
Thank you, Doc, for that key clarification between what's normally called a linear causal series and a hierarchal causal series, and then also the fact that the difficulties are often more so confusion around the proofs and confusion around God than God himself or the proofs, as we've articulated here. And so God exists, certain according to reason, by the existence of things, by change, by our desire for the limitless common to mankind, and by the very real knowledge of perfection by which we judge imperfection, and also proclaimed infallibly God's existence by the Catholic Church. This is Think Catholic. My name is Austin Habish with Clare and Dr. Fimister, and thanks again for joining us.